Plugin of the week is the Universal Audio Oxide plugin. The Oxide plugin by Universal Audio is a simplified version of their A800 and ATR 102 plugins. If you're into those type of plugins, which I am really very much into, it has all of the alignment controls, all the different flavors of tape, recording levels, the ability to individually control the equalization circuitry and all of this other stuff. And if you're really into that type of thing, which I am, then you can go in, you could just kind of be a complete tweak monster and get right into it. Now, with this, what they've done is they've taken that and they've put it in a simplified platform. Now, this plugin itself actually applies the upsampling technology. So when the input signal comes in, it upsamples it, processes it accordingly, and then brings it back down through the insert. So many of the Universal Audio plugins apply the same technology. What you have for simplified controls essentially are 15 and 7.5 in terms of inches per second, two equalization curves, the CCIR and the NAB equalization. This is designed to compensate for the playback characteristics of an analog tape head. What happens is that you lose 60 dB per octave as you go down in frequency every octave. So it actually plays back low frequencies less efficiently than it does high frequencies. And at some point it peaks out. At 30 inches per second on a Studer, it's somewhere around 65K. So when you get down at 15, it's at like 35K, still well above the hearing range. But when you get down to 7.5, it peaks out somewhere around 17K, 18K or so. So it starts to get a little bit more into the audible range and has a kind of drop off. The primary difference, though, that you'll hear between 15 and 7.5 is that you'll get a different kind of characteristic bump on the low end in terms of the way that it works. So that's really what you're listening for, is more of that low end bump and then how that kind of images based on the amount of tape compression and all the other things. And then you could adjust the CCIR or NAB equalization curve accordingly. The way that you primarily work the plugin is with the input and output controls. Just before we get to that, just one quick thing. The noise, this allows you to have tape hiss and the hum that comes as a natural part of working with the tape machine. You can set the plugin to work on input, which means that you get no tape saturation, but you actually get the sound of the electronics or the audio running through the electronics of the tape machine itself. In repro, you get the effect of the signal being recorded onto the tape and played back through the repro electronics. So primarily when you're working with the plugin, what you're doing is you're controlling the input and output controls to determine the amount of saturation. Now, just to kind of give you a little bit of a quick primer here on how the saturation works, essentially the way that we think of compressors is that we have sort of a fixed threshold, and signals below threshold are not being compressed. Once they pass above threshold, then the attack release characteristics sort of kick in. Now, with magnetic oxide particles, when a magnetic field is applied to the magnetic oxide particles, they are inherently resistant to that. The whole idea of adding a bias current is it's meant to break up that resistance so that the oxide particles will maintain the magnetic field applied to it, and that works pretty effectively. But what happens is that there is sort of an imaginary threshold on the tape. So instead of it kind of working on like a fixed ratio, so imagine this was, let's just kind of work, this is an area, and let's just sort of set an imaginary threshold here. So this would be the peak highest level signal. As your audio signal starts to pass above this area, so there's very little or no compression, but what happens here is that you kind of run from like a 1-to-1 ratio up to an infinity to 1 ratio, and when you get up to the max level. So it becomes a brick wall limiter at some point as you go across. And so the more level that you push in, the way that it sort of softens the blow, if you will, is it becomes increasingly resistant to the amount of magnetic field being applied to it. And therefore, this is the sort of generic way I can kind of describe the effect. And that's where you get that kind of saturation. If you continue to push the signal up past this sort of brick wall point, then you start to get into heavier distortion. So the range of the plugin allows you to kind of get within this range really effectively. So you can get a kind of moderate warming effect, or you can get a real deep saturation effect. One of the other things that happens with an audio signal that is part of the sonic character is what's called a modulation distortion. So if we take just an audio signal like, a sine wave that we're feeding through, what it actually plays back like coming from an analog tape is sort of a fuzzy version, because the magnetic oxide particles cannot possibly, as well designed as an analog tape the actual tape itself can be made, the number of oxide particles and the density of them can't be identical in every part of the tape. And so those subtle variations create a subtle distortion in level. So it's like the level is sort of modulating a little bit. And that modulation distortion also is part of what makes the sound of an analog tape image so well and create this sense of depth and air. So let's go back and just kind of do a couple of quick audio examples so you can kind of hear it. So I have a bunch of Oxide plugins that are on here, and we'll take a peek at a couple of them. This one is just on the mix bus, so I'm going to bypass and let's just listen to a little bit of audio, and then I'll kind of show you how you can kind of quickly set this up. So most of the audio tracks on this have an Oxide plugin on them, already kind of giving a little bit of grit and warmth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this in, and primarily the way that we work the plugin is we're going to set the amount of saturation. So the way that we'll set it will be different based on the track. So in what the meter actually shows you here is it's not the input signal, it's the signal just before the output level control. So in other words, when the signal goes in, it hits the tape saturates it, and then you're seeing the playback of that prior to the output. So this will not affect what you see on the VU meter. So as you're driving it, what you'll find in general is that signals that are more sustaining, things like basses, guitars, pianos, keyboards, will have a tendency, or string pads, things like that, will have a tendency to, you can kind of push them a little bit higher in level without getting as much saturation. Things that are more transient in nature, percussion, kicks, snares, and those sorts of things, will tend to drive the tape. You won't see the peak appear on the VU, so that peak will be way above, and that's where you'll get like this kind of soft clipping type of effect on the top end on the peak signals. It actually helps to create the warming effect. So essentially when you drive it, you're kind of pushing a little bit more in that way. So let's listen to it just with the 0 setting, and this probably will be hitting a little bit hard, so I'll make some adjustments accordingly. All right, just gonna kill one set of parallel tracks here for a second. So you can already hear the depth and warmth that it brings in. Now let's kind of play with a couple of the settings here. In particular, notice when I switch between the inches per second, the depth and imaging characteristic of the low frequencies, because it's that low frequency bump that you're primarily looking for when you're deciding between the 15 and the 7.5. That's one aspect of it, and also notice the very top end and how that's affected. So you can really hear that bump. It's pretty significant. It can be pretty significant at 15 inches per second on this particular track. So that bump seems to be lining up pretty well with the kick drum. Now let's check out the CCIR versus NAB equalization curve. So you'll notice that there's a different characteristic sound here, and when you work individually on individual tracks like this, you'll notice that this effect will be different. So in this particular case, you could hear there's so much more definition in the mid-range and the CCIR. It just seems so much clearer. And in the NAB, there's a little bit more of a ballsier kind of low end, and a little bit crisper top end. But the overall presence and mid-range and focus seems to be there effectively on the CCIR setting. And this is the basic way that you would use the plugin. And then you could determine creating less saturation, so we could just do it as a more subtle warming type of thing. And so it's less compressing and kind of pulling things down and allowing the sounds to kind of individually open up a little bit more on the mix. So this is really kind of set up more for a track-by-track type of thing, but I wanted to demonstrate that because that's the quick and easy example. On something like a bass, we can just kind of hear a quick example here where we can, where we could take it. I'm just going to show you how you can saturate it. So that starts to get a little bit more of like a Moog kind of distortion there when you kind of overdrive it that well, or that heavily. But if you want a little more openness, right? So that gives you richer low end. That gives you more mid-range focus. And then you can kind of work with it accordingly. So you can hear the range that it kind of gives you here. Let's kind of just work in a kick drum here. And get these two guys to kind of pop together a little bit. And go back. So this kick drum is going to saturate a little bit faster and a little bit more. So let me just take this bass out for a second. And you can hear how as I push this, the needle is not going a whole lot more because that transient peak is just getting eaten alive. And then the low end energy is just kind of coming up. So you could hear that it's like kind of hit a ceiling, and I'm basically bringing out the sustain of the kick drum. And also the fact that my gain is needs to be matched better. I'll start there. And that adds like a nice richness to it. So let me just kind of back off here and do something a little bit more subtle on it. And that might be a more typical record level for a kick drum like this. So you could see here how that NAB equalization creates a little more openness in the mid-range, makes it sink lower, cut more. So it's not necessarily the case that this will work in every kind of mode. Let's go to 7.5, see what that's like. You hear how that really drives that low end. Let's move it back with the bass. You can see how the playing with those two characteristics allows me to get the kick and the bass to kind of work together a little bit better. And this is just got to give you like a basic idea of how powerful this plugin works and how you can just sort of shape things with it. Really amazing plugin. Really love this one. It's just an incredible tool when you start working with it. The way that they've set it up is that primarily you would start off with this as your first insert. Now you'll notice here that I have it as the last insert primarily because I'm adding it into an existing mix. And what I've found is that if I bring that plugin into an existing mix and I put it at the first stage, what ends up happening is because now I'm messing with the transients and the tonal character, the processing that follows now all of a sudden doesn't quite make as much sense. And in that case, I would put it after. If you're starting a mix, then you might want to start a mix by kind of shaping everything out, laying everything out first with this plugin as the first plugin in your chain, and then kind of build your processing post that. So this is like a great way of being able to kind of give a nice analog warmth and shape to your overall mix before you even start digging into your plugin chain. So there you have it. There's a Universal Audio Oxide plugin. Really, really good one with the upsampling technology and everything. Really brilliant sounding. Great job by Universal Audio once again. And the Universal Oxide plugin is the plugin of the week.